Hi, I'm Macy from the Charleston County Public Library, and thanks for watching this virtual program. September is Library Card Sign-Up Month, and your Charleston County Library card is the key to a wealth of information and resources for free. Of course, we have tons of books. We also have movies, telescopes, museum passes, and gaming tablets for kids. And your library card gives you access to tons of digital content, like ebooks, audiobooks, music, and magazine subscriptions, plus access to databases for professional development, learning a new language, and genealogy research. Your library card is available for free if you live in Charleston County. Just stop by your neighborhood branch with your proof of address and your ID. For more information, visit ccpl.org.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Useless Information. My name is Darryl Woods, down here in the lower left-hand corner. I work in adult services at Hollywood St. Paul's, and today we're going to be talking about some movies. Just some general movie trivia that I think you're going to find interesting, hopefully. We're going to start with some movie firsts, some firsts in the world of cinema. The very first narrative fiction film, which of course is what we think of as movies, was a French movie, and you're going to have to, pardon my French, I think it's pronounced La Fée aux Choux, which means the Cabbage Fairy. It was produced in 1896, and perhaps even more interesting is that it was directed by a French woman, Alice Guy Blanchet. And what I find interesting about this is that the very first director of what we think of as a movie was a woman, and yet a woman did not win an Academy Award for Best Director until 2008 when Catherine Bigelow won for The Hurt Locker. Because this was the first narrative fiction film, this also was the very first screenplay back in 1896. The first feature film ever released was the story of the Kelly Gang. What makes this different from the previous one is that it is a feature film. It's a feature length, what we would consider feature length, which is somewhere generally between an hour to 4 hours. Now we think of as hour and a half is about feature length or more. It was an Australian movie about the Ned Kelly gang. So the first feature film was a kind of a almost kind of a gangster type thing, except for Wild Wild West gang. And it was released in Britain. So America had nothing to do with this. So what was the first American feature film? The very first American feature film was an adaptation of Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. Gosh, I'm doing a lot of French today. It was directed by J. Stuart Blackton in 1909. The first and only X-rated movie to win an Academy Award for Best Picture was Midnight Cowboy, which was produced in 1969, directed by John Schlesinger. Of course, the ratings were a little bit different back then. Today, this would probably receive an R rating. Very few things receive an X anymore. And it's not typically what we would today think of as an X-rated movie, and that it didn't necessarily focus on pornography. Although there were certainly some nudity and sexual situations and things like that. The first and only G-rated movie to ever win an Academy Award for Best Picture was Oliver, 1968, directed by Sir Carol Reed. Another interesting piece of information, Disney Studios has been producing movies since 1923. They didn't put out their first sequel until 1990, which was The Rescuers Down Under, obviously a sequel of The Rescuers. Some other interesting firsts in cinema. The first on-screen kiss occurred in 1896. It was about a 17-second long film called The Kiss, and all it was two people making out for 17 seconds. The first film with full frontal nudity was made all the way back in 1915, called The Hypocrites, directed by Lois Weber. It was a kind of an anti-religious movie, talking about all of the problems with modern religion. The first film about body swapping was produced in 1916. So it's interesting how that has been such a rich genre for movies all the way since 1916. The movie was Vice Versa, directed by Maurice Elvey. And if you're wondering if the movie with Fred Savage and Judge Reinhold that came out in the 80s was a remake of this movie, yes, it was. In fact, this movie has been remade about 5 or 6 times. Speaking of remakes, The Squaw Man was the very first movie remake. It was remade in 1918, and then again remade again in 1931. All 3 movies were all directed by Cecil B. DeMille. So apparently he really liked this movie, or he really kept wanting to get it right, I guess. Not quite sure. So let's talk about box office. This has been in the news a lot lately, especially in the last year, when, of course, Avengers Endgame was making its march on the #1 spot. I'm going to show you the top 10 list for world box office gross. I'm going to show it to you chronologically. So the oldest movie in the top 10 is Titanic from 1997. Comes in the #3 spot. The next oldest is Avatar, 2009. Titanic, by the way, was the very first movie to ever gross over $1 billion, and you see that more than doubled that. So it was quite the groundbreaking movie. Then at #8, we got The Avengers in 2012. And then 2015 was a big year where we have 3 movies that crashed the top 10. Star Wars: The Force Awakens was the #1 box office movie in both 2015 and 2016 because it was released over Christmas. So it did enough in December to take the top spot, and did enough after the new year in order to keep the top spot for the next year. Avengers Infinity War 2018, so just 2 years ago, and notice we've got 3 spots left for 2019. Avengers Endgame did end up claiming the top spot, but then we've also got the Lion King live-action CGI remake, came in at #7, and the sequel to Frozen is at #10, which is something that makes me kind of question the validity of this whole list. Certainly the numbers are correct, but there really wasn't a lot of hype around Frozen 2 compared to the original. A lot of people were, singing the Frozen songs, Let It Be and all that, Build a Snowman. I just remember that being quite a moment in the zeitgeist, but it seemed like Frozen 2 wasn't quite that big of a deal, wasn't nearly as big of a deal. And for it to come in at in the 10th spot, and for a movie like Furious 7, I mean, who was really all that excited about Furious 7 that the thing grossed over $1.5 billion? So there's a couple things at play here. The most significant is probably the fact that the international market has never been more hungry for American films, particularly China, which has kind of opened itself up to American cinema. That was never a market before, and now, of course, is perhaps the most important market because it has more people in it than any other country. So that certainly has something to do with it. Another thing that has to do with it is inflation. These numbers aren't weighted for inflation. These are just who made the most dollars, regardless of how much a dollar was actually worth. So I want to look at this top 10 again, but this time I want to look at just domestic box office, and I just want to look at only ticket sales. And I think we're going to see, for the most part, a very, very different list. Once again, I'm going to give it to you chronologically. The oldest movie in our top 10 is Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs from all the way back in 1937, and it sold 109 million tickets, which of course at the time was the most ever. Gone with the Wind came out a couple years later and almost doubled the amount of tickets sold of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and as you see, it holds our top spot. Number 6 is The Ten Commandments in 1956. Then in 1965, 9 years later, we had two big movies, The Sound of Music and Dr. Zhivago. And then The Exorcist was the big movie of 1973 at over 110 million tickets sold. Then Jaws, which is considered the very first summer blockbuster, came out in 1975. And 2 years later was the original Star Wars. 178.5 million, a bunch. E.T. in 1982 at 104 million, fourth place. And then rounding out the top 10 on our most recent movie is Titanic. Remember, the very first movie to ever make more than $1 billion, but it came by it honestly at 135.5 million tickets sold. So as you see, a very different list, and I might suggest a much better list than what we saw for the highest grossing films. So let's stick with the topic of box office. What is the top box office hit of this year so far? You might be really scratching your head. Of course, we've had a very strange year, and movie theaters have been closed for months in most parts of the country, maybe even most parts of the world. The answer is Bad Boys for Life, starring Will Smith and Martin Lawrence. Who knew? It has sold $204.4 million, made $204.4 million at the box office. What was the most expensive movie ever to be made? Once again, you might be surprised to find out it's Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides. The fourth movie in that franchise is also the most expensive. It cost $378.5 million to make. Don't worry, though. It way more than made that back. It made close to $1 billion at the box office. So, what movie is the most over budget? Well, Cleopatra was supposed to have a $2 million budget, which was a large budget for the time. However, it ended up costing, in modest estimations, over $20 million. So it went at least 10 times over its budget. Of the highest grossing movies, 50 highest grossing movies. So once again, we're talking domestically, and we are adjusting for inflation. Of the 50 highest grossing movies, the movie that is worst rated by audiences, The Last Jedi. Now keep in mind, none of the movies in the top 50 are going to be hated by audiences, because obviously they were buying tickets to these things to make them some of the 50 highest grossing films. What's interesting, though, is that only 44% of audiences seem to view The Last Jedi favorably. What movie is the worst rated by critics? Well, once again, it's in the Star Wars universe. This time it was The Phantom Menace. The first of the prequels was the worst rated by critics. Interesting. What about the best movies? The highest rated by audiences is a pretty cool one, The Godfather. Yeah, very Yeah, a lot of dynamics, very well-made movie for one thing, very interesting, good acting. You've got a lot of stuff that really appeals to audiences in here. You've got a lot of drama, you've got some violence, you got mafia movies, the whole thing. Just, yeah, wonderful movie. What movie did the critics like the most? Well, it's a tie. All critics at the time that these two movies were released had favorable impressions of these two movies. So both of these were 100% favored by critics. Of the 50 highest grossing movies, only 3 of them are rated R. We've already talked about 2 of them. The Exorcist, which is in the top 10 for gross, number 9. The Godfather, that is the top-rated movie by audiences. And one that we haven't talked about yet is the original Beverly Hills Cop. What movie out of the 50 highest grossing films had the highest body count? I'll give you a second to think about it. The answer is Titanic, in which 307 people were shown dying, which is not as many people as actually died on the Titanic. What movie had the best-selling soundtrack of the 50 highest-grossing movies? Once again, going to give you a quick second here to think. The answer is Forrest Gump. It sold over 12 million copies, which is more than any other. And, of course, it had this very lush soundtrack from that kind of covered a lot of different time spans, but was heavy in the 60s and 70s, had some great tracks on it, kind of a greatest hits kind of thing of that time period. So the highest grossing movies, what one had the best return on investment? So how much money was made based on how much money it cost to make the movie? The runner-up, and I say runner-up because it's very close to being number one. Number one is Gone with the Wind. And it made back $52 for every dollar spent. It's pretty darn good, but there's one that did even better. The best return on investment by any movie was Love Story. It made back $53 for every dollar spent, and one of the reasons for that, obviously, it's in the 50 highest grossing movies. It also had, by far, the lowest budget. It was made for under $2 million, which, at the time, wasn't a crazy amount of money for making a movie. Ryan O'Neal claims he didn't get paid at all for being in this movie. Ally McGraw says she barely got paid anything for being in the movie, and those were the two who took up almost all of the screen time. So yeah, very bare bones production. Obviously, there are movies that have had even better return on investment. For instance, I think about the Blair Witch Project had a higher return on investment, but it was not one of the 50 highest grossing movies. Which ones had the longest running times? And we're going to start with number 3. Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments came in at 3 hours and 40 minutes, which today would seem like an extremely long movie, but there are 2 that are even longer. Gone with the Wind at nearly 4 hours. And Cleopatra, which topped 4 hours. 4 hours and 8 minutes. Which ones had the shortest running times? Number 3 was 101 Dalmatians. So you're getting more than 1 Dalmatian per minute when we come in at 79 minutes. The Jungle Book has the second shortest running time. And to round out the top 3, we've got another classic Disney movie, Sleeping Beauty, and to be honest, I can't even imagine how they packed in 75 minutes on a story that could be told by anybody in probably about 5 minutes. But of course, yeah, I suppose a lot that can be said for a lot of movies. But I mean, there's just not a lot that goes on in Sleeping Beauty. They really padded it, I think. But okay. So some other interesting facts. There have been 11 movies that were based on Saturday Night Live sketches. That's a bunch, and especially seeing many of these probably did not deserve to be made. The Blues Brothers was perhaps the best of the bunch, came out in 1980. And then between 1992 and 1999, they made 9 more of these, from Wayne's World to Ladies' Man, and then they waited another 10 years before they came out with MacGruber, which is a funny but extremely stupid movie. Most of these are extremely stupid movies that you kind of wonder, why did they ever have to be made? But they also, some of them definitely have some good laughs in them. All right, so Titanic set the record for being at the number 1 at the box office for 15 consecutive weeks. What movie knocked it off its perch? Speaking of disappointing movies, Lost in Space. What movie has the record for the lowest grossing movie? It took in only $30 at the box office. And the answer is Isaac's Road. And you look at that, it's got a couple decent actors in it. Tom Sizemore, Katherine Heigl. It purposely only appeared in one theater in Los Angeles County for 1 week. And only 6 people bought tickets that were being sold for $5 a piece. Strange story. Alright, so we are at the end. I got a lot of my information from these sources that you see here. And if you enjoyed this, I bet you're probably going to enjoy our virtual trivia night. It happens every Thursday at 8 p.m. And on Facebook, you can either go to the URL that you see here, or you can go to Facebook and type in Virtual Trivia Night, and you will find us. So I thank you very much for your time. I would love it if you would leave a little comment here below, here on Facebook, or you can send questions, comments, and suggestions to my email that you see here at the bottom of the screen. Love to hear from you. Love to get a little feedback. So until next time, bye-bye.